What's up, everyone? Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 97, and I am the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone. On today's show, I'm breaking down Biden confirming that the U.S. will not be withdrawing troops from Afghanistan by May 1st, and that was agreed to in the U.S. Taliban so called peace agreement, but rather Biden now plans to withdraw all U.S. troops from Afghanistan by September 11th. So we'll discuss Biden kicking the can down the road and if September 11th will really mean the end of America's longest war. So be sure to share today's show. You can find the video versions on YouTube and at Odysee. Audio is wherever people listen to podcasts. And then the show is hosted at the Libertarian Institute, where I also write the daily news roundup. So check out all of that. Also check out the show's social media accounts. We're on MeWe, Facebook, and Twitter. We post short clips from all the shows, some highlights from the episodes. So be sure to share those out when you see them posted there. They are helping to bring a new audience to the show. And last, check out the sponsor of the show, Paloma Verde. PalomaVerdeStore.com is where you should go to get your CBD products. If you're new to CBD, they have an education tab. If you know what you like with CBD, Paloma Verde is the place to go because they're high quality products. They're lab tested. Their products come in a variety of different forms, whether it's a soft gel, a gummy, extract, different kinds of topicals and lotions. I really like the topicals. My co-host Will Porter enjoys the CBD that's infused with melatonin, whether in an extract or a soft gel. But they have a variety of products that could do a benefit in a variety of different ways, whether it's with some mental health relief, anxiety, depression, just feeling angst and loneliness with what's happening in the past year, or physical pain. You can also feel some relief that way too. Really helps to fight the inflammation. So PalomaVerdeStore.com. Use the promo code PEACE, PEACE, for 25% off when you check out, and that gets you a discount, and it also gets the show a kickback. Now let's get into the episode. The first thing I want to talk about on today's show is this latest police killing in Minneapolis, Dante Wright. This is gaining a lot of national attention because he's killed in the city that George Floyd was killed in, but not only that, the police officer who killed George Floyd is currently on trial. And so there's protests and activism in Minneapolis already going on around that. And of course, it spans where you have a similar story here, a cop killing in this case, a younger black man. Dante Wright was 20 years old and was killed by police officer Kim Potter. I believe she, or at least read somewhere that she had about 26 years of experience on the force. And I'm going to go ahead and play the video here. I know most people only listen to the audio, but it's a very short clip, only 36 seconds. And the audio is important here because you can actually hear the officer and what she says and how this young man ends up dead. Don't, you can stop, bro. Don't do it. Don't do it. Oh, wow. Okay, so that is again like the 30-second video where Officer Kim Potter ends up shooting Dante Wright. For those of you who are just listening, the first about 15 seconds, he seems to have his hands behind his back. I'm not sure what the cops are. They're changing cuffs, loosening the cuffs, or trying to put the cuffs on. He then slips out, and then for about 5 seconds, he's like struggling to get back into his car to drive away, apparently, because the car does start to move, it seems, after he's shot. And like 22 to 23 seconds, you hear Miss Potter say taser as she's pointing. You could see her service weapon at him. It's a black handgun. It's not the big yellow taser. She says taser a couple more times before shooting him, and then swears, says, "Oh, I shot him," and I believe says she meant to tase him. So this it seems to be the way it unfolded authentic, that she really did think she had her taser in her hand. And I know there's a lot of people saying that, a taser's, one thing, it's light, it's yellow, it doesn't feel the same as a gun. But at the same time, this unfolds over the course of just a couple seconds here. And so it's not like she looked at her hand, or she's, looking at the Dante Wright. But that doesn't change the fact that she murdered this kid. And so, of course, because she's a cop, she doesn't get arrested on the scene. I believe 4 or 5 days later, she does end up first resigning from the force, and then she was charged and arrested with second-degree manslaughter. It seems more like a murder to me. I mean, I don't think it was necessarily the most intentional murder that's ever happened, but nonetheless, she did kill this young man. So I think that's all you really need to know about this case, is what unfolded right there. Because, you see that she was trying to tase him. It doesn't really matter what she was doing before. She wasn't attempting to use lethal force, and ended up using lethal force on him anyways. So, that's how Dante Wright ends up dying. Now, there's been a lot of focus on his criminal history. And again, this isn't really in a lot of ways relevant to what happened. In some ways it is, when you talk about why he had interactions with the police officers in the first place and why they were trying to arrest him. But it also is being used, his criminal history, as, well, you live by the sword, you die by the sword, kind of, this was the life he was in, and he ends up getting shot by a cop because, he played with guns and drugs and games and stuff like that. So what the initial story was that he got pulled over for having something in the rearview mirror, and he was on the phone with his mother. This is according to his mom, either before or during the traffic stop, but definitely before he's obviously being arrested. And he says it's because there was an air freshener dangling in his rearview mirror, which is illegal. I don't know if that's something that Minneapolis police actually pull people over for, or if it's just something that they'll write you a ticket for. But I believe now it's clear that he was pulled over initially for having expired tags on his car, which from my viewpoint is just as trivial of a law as the air freshener. And a lot of people are pointing out this may be a case being pulled over for driving while black. I certainly spent a lot of time driving around in cars with expired tags, and I haven't been pulled over for that. I've, gotten a ticket for that after I was pulled over, but I've never been pulled over for that. So I don't know, to my experience, speaks to overall how likely police are to pull black versus white people over for having expired tags. But it definitely could contributed having all those things, plus being black. They decide to pull him over. Once they pull him over, they find that he has a warrant dating back to an incident that happened in on June 30th, 2020. Police were called to an incident, again, June 3rd, 2020. They say Dante was in a car with people, and he fled the car. Police didn't find him, but they found a gun, and they attributed the gun to Dante. Now, he was then arrested in August and September for breaching bail conditions from a prior case that, again, was just charges and ongoing, and I'll get to that one in a second. But they apparently didn't do anything about this allegation of fleeing police and having a gun that he shouldn't have had because he was out on bail from June 30th. And then a complaint was filed on March 4th that required him to go to court on April 2nd. His public defender, so remember, this is coming from his public defender. I see a lot of people running with this narrative that, he didn't even know about his court case. And it is possible that that's the case, but his public defender says that he doesn't think Dante knew about it. We don't know whether Dante knew about that hearing or not. And but nonetheless, he missed that court date, it appears, because on April 2nd, warrant was issued for his arrest, and so it's that arrest warrant that cops are trying to bring him in on. Now, there is an outstanding issue of a 2019 armed robbery. Him and another man are alleged to have and are charged with robbing a woman for, I think, $820. There's allegations that the victim of that robbery was choked. Now, it's important to remember that these are just charges. I'm not aware at all any details of this case, if it really was Dante, if there's question if it was him, what was his involvement in all of this. But you're especially seeing on a lot of right-wing media using this 2019 case to smear the young man, but it doesn't seem like it really had any factor actually in him getting shot, other than that would have been the reason that he couldn't have had a gun, I guess, on June 30th. As far as I could tell, he had past run-ins with the law for selling marijuana and a disorderly conduct misdemeanor. That doesn't seem like anything very serious. So, very unfortunate for the family of Dante Wright. You see the mother saying that there's never going to be justice because their son won't be alive, and it's absolutely tragic that he was murdered in a way that I don't think the lady who murdered him actually did it. I think she meant to tase him. Of course, look back at the bigger system and see all the places where the current laws and justice system puts young men, especially like Dante, in so much more contact with police that there's a lot more chance that they attempt to get arrested and something like this happens. I will say I'm really tired of the whole play stupid games, win stupid prizes arguments when it comes to this kind of thing, saying if he hadn't fled then he wouldn't have been shot. I mean, the problem with that is that the lady just drew the wrong weapon. So there are times where police unnecessarily tase people, and that could have happened in this case as well. It was clearly the mistake of the officer that led to him dying, not necessarily his decision to flee. There's also plenty of cases too we see where people are 100% compliant with cops and they end up killing or deploying the taser anyways. A lot of people are making the comparison with Daniel Shaver, and that's an absolutely great one, where police, I believe in Arizona, forced the man to crawl on the ground and then executed him. And then also there's a lot of people making a big deal out of Dante having photos online of him holding a gun. I'm a Second Amendment guy. I know a lot of other people are as well. I see there's a lot of people who, the Republican type of Second Amendment, quote unquote, people who really just care about, maybe having guns to protect them or their family. And they're really not big on people like Dante owning guns. And so, you see them posting pictures with guns just like Dante, and then, them saying, this shows he was a thug or something like that. So all those are absurd narratives, and I think more serious charges should probably be applied to the former police officer here, Kim Potter, but at the very least, there have been some charges applied. Next, I want to look at the case of Marvin Scott. Marvin Scott died 4 weeks ago, and his family has been protesting every day at the Texas jail that he was killed. Apparently, some of the officers actually involved in his death were fired, but we still don't have details on what actually happened. So Marvin Scott III was killed in Collin County Jail in Texas, and I'm unclear on the day he actually died. It could have been the 14th, maybe it was the 15th. Scott was arrested March 14th on marijuana charges. The family lawyer says that Scott is diagnosed with schizophrenia and he used marijuana to self-medicate. I worked with several young men who had schizophrenia about the age of Scott, and I could say that quite a few of them preferred marijuana to the other drugs that were available to them. And I mean, it criminalizes having a mental illness to make it so that this kid can't just smoke the weed he wants to legally. But because of this, they arrest him with the marijuana. He's taken to a general hospital, not a mental health hospital, and due to strange behavior, the hospital then released him to the jail again. I don't see any exact timeline on how long he was at the hospital, but then while he was at the jail, the erratic behavior must have continued because officers decided to restrain Scott, pepper spray him, and cover his head with a spit hood. At some point, he became unresponsive and was pronounced dead at the hospital. And it would kind of surprise me if all of this, so he was arrested at 9 p.m. and then would die later that day, that all this occurred in 3 hours. I suppose it is possible. Now, from my understanding, again, 7 cops involved were fired and 1 resigned. The family is demanding that charges be placed on the cops, and that has not happened yet. And they want the names of the police officers to be released. Video does exist of this incident, but it has not been released to the public yet. They say that the Texas Rangers have the video evidence. The family hired their own forensic pathologist. The medical examiner for the state hasn't put out the results yet, and the family medical pathologist concluded the physical struggle of the restraint as well as possible asphyxiation from the restraint would likely be the causes of death, and negative autopsy, meaning no injuries, no blunt force trauma, is consistent with that. So it was the combination of the restraint, the pepper spray, the spit hood, I guess all together that ended up with Mr. Scott being killed. You had a bunch of people, around 7 of them. They let this mentally ill young man die in prison. It's absolutely atrocious, and maybe for them manslaughter charges are more appropriate than murder. We'll have to wait to see the video evidence, but these people need to be held accountable. Now, you have a very interesting thing here where some people like Marvin Scott end up, being so poorly treated by the law enforcement and the authority, and then other people that are a part of the government particularly seem to get off with doing just about anything. And this guy, James Hendricks, is no exception. He was a WMD group at FBI headquarters, and then he was promoted to the head of the New York field office in Albany, where he oversaw about 200 people, and he was described as a skilled predator. One woman at the FBI headquarters said that she carried a ruler to hit Hendricks with when he reached for her legs or breast. 8 other women, I guess, have the Department of Justice Inspector General found that 8 other women, I guess, had credible claims that he harassed them, and then he was allowed to retire at the age of 50, with the pension and everything like that. It's absolutely crazy. He claims that he was just joking, and the woman took things out of context. Of course, I think one woman said that she had a sexual relationship with him and felt pressure to do that. Just absolutely atrocious behavior. Things that you seem almost cartoonish, that a woman would have to, carry around a ruler to slap somebody's hands with. You hear that kind of thing and you assume that either doesn't happen or the person gets fired immediately. And at least if you work in the FBI, you are able to get away with that. And so just wanted to talk about how, different standards get applied to different people. And not only do his victims not get his pension, he actually got to retire at 50 and is, I'm sure, enjoying a quite large payment he gets every month. All right, on to some good news. New Mexico's governor signs marijuana legalization bill, making it the 3rd state to enact the reform within days. I got this article here from Marijuana Moment. It's a pretty good breakdown of what's actually in the bill. So the bill will allow adults over the age of 21 to carry 2 ounces of marijuana, although there will be no legal sales at least until April of 2022, so a year from now. Although where I'm guessing if it's legal now, as long as police don't see or like entrap you into buying weed from them, then you'll be all right. There's no limit on the number of licenses that the state will give out as far as growers and sellers. So that's some good news. There have been states where they limit the number of legal dispensaries so much that it really makes it hard to use them anyways. Of course, having no legal sales from dispensaries from 2022 ensures that all the sales will be on the black market at least till then. Once weed is legal, it's going to be a 12% tax on top of the 8% tax that the state already has. And then that tax will actually increase to 18% by 2030. It forces producers to reserve at least 10% of their products for medical and people with medical card. It's also going to allow people with medical card from other states to access, legal medical marijuana in New Mexico. They say local government can't outright ban dispensaries, but will be able to use zoning laws to limit the number of dispensaries or be able to limit where dispensaries are, saying they're too close to schools or other public buildings. Tribal governments, there's some reservations in New Mexico, will be able to participate. They should give these people a huge tax break and just let them do whatever they want with marijuana, I suppose, though. There are some procedures to help communities that were most impacted by the prohibition of cannabis. And so this seems like something that would be good. Some states have legalized marijuana in a way that really makes it incorporate and industrialized. And so all the profits are going to people who are already wealthy. The war on drugs has obviously disproportionately impacted poor and particularly minority communities in the U.S. And so, when you make getting the licenses and stuff like that really complicated, it makes it very difficult for people in communities that they don't have money to hire a lawyer to actually be able to get in on the legal weed business. That there are some of those in the bill is good, although they did strip out a number of the things that were suggested in that bill through different legislative means in the process. And then it does institute a new cannabis control division. It seems like that's going to be an important part of how this division ads, and if they're looking to expand marijuana use and make it so that it's not criminalized, and maybe it expands the wrong word, or if they're going to look to just get as much money for the state as they can and not necessarily help just facilitate the people being able to legally use and sell marijuana. All right. We have some news that I found really interesting, and that is Biden is now going ahead with a planned weapon sale to the UAE. This was signed in the waning days of the Trump administration and is a $23 billion sale. I had the write-up here by Kelly Bicar-Vallejos at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. She writes, according to the State Department spokesperson, the Biden administration has taken the hold off a controversial sale of F-35s, drones, and bombs, $23 billion worth, to the United Arab Emirates. And this, of course, is so objectionable, not only because of the human rights abuses by the United Arab Emirates, but also because this triggers some issues between the U.S. and Israel. The U.S. guarantees Israel better weapons than all of its Arab neighbors. If it's getting F-35s and Reaper drones, Israel said this is an issue. And so the U.S. may have to sell more arms to Israel now because we're selling more arms to the UAE. This is problematic because both Israel and the UAE are terrible human rights abusers, and I don't want any weapons going to those companies. It also enriches the military industrial complex, which continues to feed into this whole loop where we spend $1 trillion a year on our military and pass all kinds of laws that restrict the freedom of just average people and make average people suffer while the rich get richer. Now I want to move on to talking about Afghanistan. The first thing I'll play is a short clip from Biden's statement that he actually posted on the official presidential YouTube Twitter account here. And so I will play that. People watching, there are subtitles here. For those of you just listening, you will be able to hear it.
For the withdrawal and expecting a different result. I'm now the 4th United States president to preside over American troop presence in Afghanistan. 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats. I will not pass this responsibility on to a 5th. After consulting closely with our allies and partners, with our military leaders and intelligence personnel, with our diplomats and our development experts, with the Congress and the Vice President, as well as with Mr. Ghani and many others around the world, I've concluded that it's time to end America's longest war. It's time for American troops to come home.
All right, so the statement itself sounds fairly positive, right? Biden is saying that it's time for American troops to come home, it's time to end this war. However, once we start getting into the details, I don't think it's actually going to mean an end of America's longest war. Certainly not the end of America's longest war for American contractors in Afghanistan, and definitely not for the people of Afghanistan, who I think will still live under the tyranny of a U.S. air war. Let's see. Let's start going and breaking down some of the details here. The first one is, of course, that Biden's going to withdraw all U.S. forces by September 11th. Now, that date doesn't sound, I guess, crazy at this point, but I think once we get to August, and especially if we get to August and a couple of Americans have died between May and August in Afghanistan, the Warhawks are really going to play up the idea that withdrawing, particularly on the September 11th, is a victory for the terrorists and also a slap in the face to the Americans who have died during the war on terrorism, whether that victims of terrorist attacks or U.S. soldiers who have died in Afghanistan. And so that was my first concern. I don't know why Biden would pick that date. I think September 1st would sound a lot better. And that September 11th, again, I think is going to invoke Warhawks, and they're going to try to use emotion to say that, oh my God, look at how Biden is insulting the legacy of the people who gave their lives in this conflict by conceding defeat on 9/11. Now, one little bit of good news here is that there are senior administration officials saying that withdrawing from Afghanistan by September 11th is not conditions based. Biden has judged that a conditions based approach, which has been the approach of the past 2 decades, is a recipe for staying in Afghanistan forever. I think he's absolutely right about the conditions-based approach being a recipe for staying in Afghanistan forever. And the fact that Biden has identified this, I think is really important, and it's great if this is actually true. The problem is, I think the withdrawal is going to end up being conditions based, and that the political situation in the U.S. means that it will end up being conditions based. At the same time, at this point, at least Biden has identified that as being a serious problem. Let's see. We'll also have a withdrawal of NATO forces. There's around 7,000 non-U.S. forces, mainly from NATO countries, and then also some from Australia, New Zealand, and Georgia. And they will withdraw at the same point that the U.S. does, or within the schedule and rotation, mainly because they rely on U.S. Air support, planning, and leadership for all their operations in Afghanistan. With the announcement that the U.S. would not be hitting the May 1st withdrawal date and Biden pushing it back to 9/11, the Taliban said they will not attend peace talks until the U.S. leaves Afghanistan. This is somewhat problematic, I think, when the Biden administration is going to, again, be actually, whenever they're trying to withdraw troops, what the Hawks are going to be saying is that we can't leave until there's a peace deal between the Taliban and the Afghan government, and until there is one, we're going to stay. And if the Taliban aren't negotiating until the U.S. leaves, it leaves us at an impasse, and we'll just have to hope the Hawks don't win the argument at the time, and Biden remains somewhat steadfast, although it's not exactly the president that we think having a lot of backbone at this point. I got Scott Horton's reaction here. He tweeted out, I'm all negativity. The deal is broken. In 6 months, they're almost certain to kick the can down the road again. Pentagon brass want to hold on to that Bagram air base no matter what. Biden isn't man enough to stop them any more than Obama or Trump were. And I think he's pretty much right on identifying the problems. I maybe the situation in Afghanistan, the Taliban see that just for pragmatic sake, that if they could do very little over the summer and wait till September, the U.S. really won't have a choice but to leave. And maybe not that the U.S. won't have a choice but to leave, but that would pressure the U.S. into withdrawing their troops. Now, here's the whole problem. There's a big war going on in Afghanistan, and the 2,500 to 3,500 U.S. troops that are there are just a small part of it. There's the CIA, there's the contractors, there's the special operations, there's the drones, there's the airstrikes. Sometimes the airstrikes come all the way, the planes launch from the U.S. And so I had this article here from the American Prospect by Lauren Woods. In it, she writes that there are currently 6,350 U.S. contractors in Afghanistan, and the Special Inspector General for Afghan Reconstruction has assessed that withdrawing contractors may be more devastating to the Afghan security forces than withdrawing U.S. troops. And so there isn't an announcement from Biden on what that means, but we could end up, Biden claiming that the war is over, that he ended the war, and still have 6,335 Americans in Afghanistan as, armed contractors. The U.S. also employs 18,000 contractors in total. And so there's another about 12,000 contractors that aren't American and employed by the U.S. And what makes us think that to offset some of the troops leaving, that we wouldn't do something like hire more contractors, especially since I think what a lot of the troops are doing in Afghanistan is supposed to be training. They could hire troops once they get out to come back to Afghanistan and then, continue to train them. We had an announcement from the Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin. This was tweeted out by the Reuters Pentagon reporter Idris Ali. U.S. Defense Secretary Austin says the United States will look to continue funding key capabilities like that of the Afghan Air Force and continue to pay the salary of Afghan security forces. And so while we may be withdrawing our own official troops from Afghanistan, we're still going to sink a lot of American money into making sure that the Afghan army can continue to fight the Taliban. There was a really important article this week by William Arkin published at Newsweek, and it says why America can't end its forever wars. And in this article, Arkin goes through quite a few very important details of America's forever wars and how they operate right now, and explains why that even something like withdrawing troops really doesn't end the war. And so he says U.S. war is increasingly bombs, drones, and cyber, and that, troops in a way present a problem for the U.S. If they're in Afghanistan, they're potential casualties, and, people deploying to Afghanistan, Americans going over there, makes the war more visible for average Americans. But when Americans aren't in Afghanistan, then the war becomes very invisible to them. He says that fighting in Afghanistan, just like U.S. wars all over the region, has increasingly shifted to clandestine CIA and special operations forces. He says currently in Afghanistan, contractors now outnumber soldiers 7-1, and that contractors can increasingly replace soldiers. Biden said that. Oh, and actually he said, he writes in this article, Arkin writes in this article that after Biden even said that we would end the war by the end of the year, there's 54 defense companies hiring for jobs in Afghanistan. All right, now I want to read a couple paragraphs from the article that I think are very important. Linking this machine together is a global network that collects and processes mountains of information, moves that information around, and sustains a worldwide targeting system, generates long-range attacks, and makes most of the decisions. This extraordinary complex network involves the participation of half the countries on Earth, a hub made up of giant command and intelligence centers, feeds spoke researching throughout the Middle East and South Asia into Africa and Asia. It is so little understood, so invisible, so resilient, and so efficient. Even as 4 successive presidents have tried to stop warfare, the spokes have grown and extended. Perpetual War is this newly created machine itself. Today, that system comprises of 24 countries where the U.S. is regularly bombing and killing. The American model facilitates withdrawal because with it, the very importance of troops, actually boots that might be worn by soldiers on the ground, has virtually disappeared as an element in killing terrorists. The consequences is not just that perpetual war increasingly takes place out of sight, but with fewer soldier deaths and injuries due to changed tactics and increasingly remote tactics, war has also become more and more relevant to the American lives. And so, Arkin is explaining there how the war has transitioned into something new, the general war on terror, and actually withdrawing troops is a part of that war on terror. And so as American troops leave Afghanistan, more contractors come back in. The U.S. may carry out more airstrikes and drone strikes. It may help or support its CIA contractors more in that country, or the different special groups in the Afghan military that's committed countless war times but continuing to work with the CIA. They may receive more and more support. The last thing I want to know from the Arkin article was just that he notes that this whole system is more reliant on AI, and that they're still short on actual translators, and so it seems like a real dangerous system where you could end up with more bad information going in, and that means killing more and more innocent people as you go. There's an important article out today, that's Thursday, the 15th of April, on what this actual exit from Afghanistan means and how much of the war is actually going to continue being fought. And it seems more and more like it really is just the troops leaving. The New York Times write, the U.S. is planning less visible but still potent force in the region. They, of course, bring up and compare to the Iraq withdrawal from 2011. And everybody says that the lesson of that, of course, is that if you ever withdraw from any country ever, ISIS will rise up. They leave off the whole part about how the U.S. supported the rebellion in Libya and then tried to funnel that rebellion into Syria, and pouring all those weapons into Syria led to the rise of ISIS. And that's why there was a huge ISIS problem in Iraq that America maybe did or didn't even need to address. But they say, well, the lesson from that is if you ever withdraw troops from everywhere, insurgents will rise up, and that's a huge problem. So I mean, that's part of what's going on here. Let's see. They say Turkey will keep some troops in Afghanistan, and so that seemed to be a change a little bit from other statements that I have read, that it's not a complete NATO withdrawal, that there will still be some Turkish troops in the country. It says that there are many ways to bomb Afghanistan, whether that's drones or long-range bombers, and that the troops that are being withdrawn will likely be sent to one of the neighboring countries, Tajikistan, Kazakhstan, or Uzbekistan. So those are all issues going on. Let's see, what are some other things pointed out in this New York Times article? They say that the civilian contractors could be used more for training, or they could just bring the Afghan troops out of Afghanistan to train with the U.S., then bring them back in, which could even present a bigger risk to the American homeland if you're bringing them to the U.S. We saw in the past how, bringing Saudis to the U.S. ended up with a shooting at a U.S. base. They say that U.S. troops could leave in 3 months if the Taliban doesn't fight American soldiers, and that came from a senior Biden official, and so that seems to signal to me that this exit is conditions based, despite what the Biden administration has said, and setting September 11th as a hard deadline. And then there was just this really interesting quote, I believe from General Lloyd Austin. There's not a space in the world U.S. or allies can't reach. And so even with leaving Afghanistan, they're saying that, look, we could go back in there and bomb anybody we want at any time, so don't worry about it. That really says to me that at least if you're an Afghan citizen, I don't know if you're going to feel like this war is ending at all. Maybe there will be less of a presence of U.S. soldiers in fatigues with their name across their chest, but that it may be even worse to have more contractors in there who aren't as, easily identifiable as soldiers doing the bidding of the U.S. government. Another interesting story that dropped today that I want to talk about dealing with Afghanistan is the U.S. intel walks back claim Russians put bounties on American troops. Oh, you don't say. Of course, if you've been a listener of this show from the beginning, me and Will Porter have been on this 100%, that this was a false story. We took a lot of heat from it because there were a lot of very prominent Democrat politicians, most notably Tammy Duckworth, that were really pushing this story. And people are saying, you guys are wrong. The Russians are doing this. And we're saying, look, the evidence doesn't add up. They're not showing the evidence. The NSA itself is assessing that this is low confidence, which means that it might be true, but the evidence actually doesn't say it's true. And here we have the U.S. intelligence community saying it had low to moderate confidence in the story at all. And that, means, as I think Spencer Ackerman writes at the Daily Beast, which was one of the main outlets pushing the Russian bounties story, that the story is at best unproven and possibly untrue. And so while moderate confidence from the U.S. intelligence community sounds like, they're pretty sure about that, what that just means, moderate confidence means that the evidence may line up, but it may not, where low confidence means that the evidence actually doesn't line up with the claim. And so it doesn't sound like that, they think it's true. It's very interesting that when Trump's trying to withdraw from Afghanistan, that this claim comes out. Then Biden tries to withdraw from Afghanistan, and wait, the intelligence community now isn't so concerned about that. I will say, though, there are a lot of Warhawks that are out there pushing the narrative that this is a terrible decision by President Biden. And so I just wanted to go through some of the highlights. There's a good thread on Twitter by Richard Haniana. And the first one he has here is a headline. I believe this is from a Matt's Boot article. Yep. Opinion: Biden's Afghanistan withdrawal could be the first step to a Taliban takeover. Let's see. We also have one from David Ignatius. History will cast a shadow over Biden's decision to withdraw from Afghanistan. And then from the New York or the Washington Post editorial board, Biden takes the easy way out of Afghanistan. The likely result is disaster. But it wasn't just the Washington Post. It was Charles Lister. FDD says that Biden didn't have to decide to lose the war in Afghanistan. Jeanne Shaheen says it undermines our commitment to the Afghan people. This is a Democratic senator, particularly Afghan women. I urge Biden to make every effort between now and September to safeguard the process made and support our partners in the formation of inclusive trade. Anyways, the point is that Jeanne Shaheen never tweets when a U.S. airstrike kills an Afghan woman, doesn't care about the life of an Afghan woman that way. But if the U.S. is going to leave the country, then any woman who's oppressed from here on out is the fault of the U.S. Tom Nichols is bad on this. Liz Cheney, of course, is out there saying that this is terrible. Lindsey Graham gave an absolutely awful statement where he's like, I wish John McCain was still alive. That way I could speed second and he could hate this thing even more than I do. Mitch McConnell says foreign terrorists will not leave the U.S. alone simply because our politicians have grown tired of fighting them. The president needs to explain to the American people how abandoning our partners and retreating in the face of the Taliban will make America safer. That's I mean, in one sense, if Biden was actually leaving Afghanistan, it may make America safer, but keeping all the, different military assets in Afghanistan, continuing to bomb the country, will make that more difficult to see that kind of benefit because, of course, we'll continue to destabilize and create pullback for ourselves. And then last, there are some Democrat senators now who are suddenly, think it's a great time to get out of Afghanistan, even though a few months ago they were very opposed to it and saying that it was too soon. The last thing I want to talk about on today's show is development with Iran. I talked about this on Monday's show, and the story was developing a blackout at the Iranian, I believe, Natanz facility where they're doing their nuclear centrifuges and enriching uranium. It was pretty clear pretty quickly that Israel at least wanted to be thought of as responsible for that attack. There were a lot of official sources talking to Israeli media, putting out that Israel behind it, and Iran is very forthright saying that Israel is behind it. In response, Iran says they're going to begin enriching uranium to 60%. The U.S. says that this is unacceptable, and so it seems very problematic from a standpoint of how are the U.S. and Iran going to move forward with talks in Vienna if there are attacks being carried out against Iran. Iran is responding by enriching uranium higher when the U.S. is trying to get Iran to enrich uranium to a lower standard. Now, one of the things that can maybe be seen as a positive step forward with talks on Iran would be if the U.S. came out, condemned the attack by Israel, and said it was a really stupid thing to do when we're trying to get back in the nuclear deal, and that guarantees that Iran isn't making a nuclear bomb. But rather than doing that, we had in the days after the attack, U.S. National Security Advisor Jake the Snake Sullivan reaffirming unwavering commitment to Israel in a joint meeting. And I mean, it's just incredible. Israel carries out this kind of attack against Iran, and rather than, trying to signal to Israel that maybe it shouldn't be doing these kind of things when we're trying to have diplomacy with Iran, it doubles down and says, Israel, we have your back, which I would think to signal to Israel to do more things like this, because what Israel wants is to maintain Iran as an enemy, not get back in the JCPOA, because the JCPOA would allow the U.S. to develop better relations with Iran. And if Iran isn't the big bad boogeyman in the Middle East, then Israel doesn't need the countless weapons and military support for the U.S. it gets. I mean, at this point, it has a relationship with all the Gulf Arab states. It has a relationship, and the U.S. spies off Egypt and Jordan. Iraq and Syria have been destroyed. Libya has been destroyed. And so, they've taken all the excuses for American military support off the table at this point. The Palestinians can't manage more than a small rocket or a rock. And, even the Houthi missiles aren't aimed at Iran, but if they were, they're pretty limited in scope. And so, it needs to keep Iran as the big bad guy in the Middle East, to keep, them in the center of U.S. policy and the U.S. embedded and engaged in the Middle East. Making sure Iran doesn't return to the deal is critical to that. And so unless the U.S. is willing to stand up to Israel and condemn one of these attacks, then I think it's unlikely that we're going to end up getting out of this mess that we're in the Middle East, and getting back in the nuclear deal, which is essential to getting out of the mess in the Middle East. All right, that's where I'm wrapping today. Hope everybody enjoyed the show. Hope it was a pretty good breakdown on the Afghanistan stuff. There's a lot left to be decided. It could be that in 6 months from now, we're completely out of Afghanistan, and we're not dropping bombs there. We're not back in the CIA thuds and goons anymore that are going around committing war crimes. We're not backing and pouring $1 billion into one of the most corrupt governments on the planet. And we've realized that after 20 years, you can't build a nation, especially not one out in the middle of Central Asia with an extremely old and complex society. That's not our business. We can't do that. But instead, I very much fear that at best, we've shifted over to a war that's mostly drone strikes, mostly CIA and special operations, that's contractors, that's drones, surveillance, but isn't U.S. troops at present on the ground in Afghanistan. But even that seems potentially unlikely at this point, and that we could just be in the same old war that we've been in for the past 20 years, and that Biden's promise to not pass it off to the next president is about as hollow as most other things that Biden promises. So that's the show. Everybody share it. YouTube, Odysee, Facebook, MeWe, Twitter are the show pages. Again, libertarianinstitute.org for all of my work, including the daily news roundup that I write. And check out Paloma Verde, palomaverdestore.com. Use the promo code PEACE. All right, we'll be back with more shows next week, including a big 100th episode.